Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to make 3D fangs like this. These fangs are made out of a suede. They are sewn together as two pieces and sewn into the satin stitching that forms the mouth, as opposed to doing something like embroidery where it would just be some thread sewn onto the pattern piece itself, or perhaps applique. It just gives this piece a little bit more interest by having these 3D teeth rather than having them flat against the head. So I'll walk you through how I do this method. So ultimately what I do to get 3D teeth is to actually stick a separate tooth piece into the satin stitching that forms the mouth on my plushie. So this is a test plush pattern piece, and you can just pattern this directly onto the pattern itself. You don't actually have to go through and make it out of fabric and then draw it on like I've done here, but I had to make a test plush anyway, so I went ahead and drew the shape on the test plush and then took it apart for its pattern. But here I've drawn the shape of the mouth, and then I've also drawn the shape of the tooth that I want as well. And since I work heavily with a printer and scanner, what I did was scan this piece directly into my computer so that I can get a one-to-one image of this pattern piece to bring into my embroidery program. You don't have to have an embroidery program to do this method. I can't say I've ever done it without an embroidery machine, but certainly the techniques I use here could be done by hand. It just might not come out as clean if you're not very careful about it. The first consideration is what type of fabric to make your tooth out of, and this depends somewhat on how big your plushies are, because if you're going to make a single-sided tooth, which means it's just going to be a single cut of fabric, then you need to keep in mind what the back of the fabric looks like. But if your plushies are large enough to where you can actually sew a tooth together so that it's two pieces of fabric, you sew the tooth in and then you can flip it right side out, then you need to consider a type of fabric that is actually pliable enough to sew such a small tooth and be able to flip it right side out. My plushies are large enough to where I'm able to do this, but if your plushies are too small to where you wouldn't be able to flip something that small right side out, you might want to use something like a felt, but a nice quality felt that wouldn't come apart when you cut it, and over time it can actually fray a little bit and just start to kind of disintegrate if you don't get a high quality felt. Or you could use a fleece too, which would be a nice quality fleece, one that doesn't pill, so you'd want to get something anti-pill, so again it wouldn't degrade over time. So some fabrics that I've used in the past to make teeth that I've flipped right side out are minky, if you want to keep an overall very soft and fuzzy look to your plushie. I've also used like a PVC, like a stretchy vinyl material here. So this is a very stretchy, shiny material. So if you'd like to get a more realistic tooth look, you could use something like this. And for this plush, I'm actually going to use a suede. So it's going to be still soft and fuzzy on one side, but it's still nice and soft, so it doesn't have a pile like minky. So you're hitting a compromise with suede between minky, which is soft and fuzzy but not very realistic, versus like that stretch vinyl that I had, which is more shiny, that could make it look like an actual tooth. But this is just a nice suede that I can actually sew together to make the tooth and flip it right side out. But regardless of what you use, just be conscious of the quality of the material. If you pick something too thin, you might be able to see through the fabric. If you are just going to make a tooth out of a single cut of fabric to where you're not going to be sewing it together and flipping it right side out, you don't want to pick a fabric that's going to fray on the edges when you cut it, so you wouldn't want to use something like a woven fabric that when you cut it, it's just going to start unraveling at the edges, because that will not look very professional. So then if you are going to go ahead and do the method where you sew two pieces of fabric together to make the tooth, you have to think about how you're going to sew it, because for something this small, it can be a little challenging to sew together. So one of my favorite techniques for sewing very small objects like this is to actually let your embroidery machine do it for you. So what I've done is hoop two pieces of this suede together and program my embroidery machine to actually stitch out the teeth for me. So it's a little bit hard to see because it's white fabric, but if I have it at this angle here, you can see the stitch lines of the two teeth. So I programmed a file to stitch this out for me so I don't have to worry about getting this precise small shape on my own. So I've let my embroidery machine do all the hard work for me. So I don't have any backing on here. This is just purely two pieces of suede fabric with right sides together and then hooped into this very small hoop that I have and just stitch out the design. So I'll quickly show you how to do this in Embroidery, but whatever program you use, all you want to do is just program a straight stitch along the seam line of your tooth. So if you wanted to program your embroidery machine to stitch out the teeth for you, all you have to do is get your image in some kind of photo editing program. I use GIMP, which is free, and get it into the size of your hoop. So this particular image here is a scan from my pattern. It is exactly the size of the hoop that I use, which is 5.12 by 7.09 inches. So I just copy and paste this directly into Embroidery. So I just go to Edit, Paste. It'll ask if I want to import an image or a vector. So I might have another embroidery piece in my clipboard, but if you just hit yes, it's going to import image only. And it'll ask if I want to scale the image to fit my hoop. I hit yes because I've already scaled it anyway, so it won't change. And now I have my pattern piece imported into Embroidery. So here is the exact shape of the tooth that I want. So all I have to do now is trace it. And I want to use an outline object, which is just going to be a straight stitch. So in Embroidery, this button right here is the outline object. So I click it and then start my stitch on the side of the tooth. Just go to the point, adjust this little circle here to match the line, and then I'll click on the end of the tooth and then again adjust this thinner circle. When I'm done, you just hit the check mark and now you have a tooth. You can right click and hit parameters to adjust the length of the stitch. This min and max length will adjust the length. So I'll often change this down to be 0.7 to get a tighter stitch, but not necessary. But if you are making something small like this, you might want to make the length a little bit smaller because it might not come out as precise, or the stitches might be just a little bit too long for something that small. So then hit OK. And so then I have one tooth, but I need two. So I will copy and paste it, drag it to the side, and then go to transform, flip horizontally. And now I have two teeth. So I don't need such a large hoop for just two tiny teeth. So I can go ahead and change my hoop size. I'm going to first delete the image because it is scaled to the 5x7, and Embroidery might not like me changing my hoop to a smaller size with this large image. So I'm going to delete the image. I'm just going to bring these teeth to the middle, and then I'm going to click the hoop button, hit custom, and then select my small hoop, which is going to be this Brother 40x60. I'm going to flip it to be horizontal, hit the check mark, hit apply. But even though I centered my teeth, they are now gone. They are somewhere off of this screen here. So if that happens, you can just select both of your items over here on the right click and hit group one, and it's going to treat them as just a single object. Then you can go to transform and hit bring to center, and it will bring them right to the middle of your hoop. So I think they're spaced far enough away. You don't want them to be too close together because you do have to cut these out. So you need to leave a little bit of fabric around them so they're not right on top of each other. Something that I'll also do sometimes if the teeth are small enough, I'll do more than just one set just in case something messes up. You'll have more than one set of teeth, or if you're doing something that you need multiple teeth, or if you're making multiple plushies, you can just duplicate these many times. So from here, you can save them and you can compile them and bring them into the Embroidery editor. So I'm just going to save this as nonsense. So I'll hit center and hoop just to keep them in the center. And then I have selected the .pes, which is my format, but you can select whatever you need here and hit OK. Then you can save them in that desired format. And I always get this prompt now about saving it in a smaller hoop size. You can hit yes or no. I don't think it really matters. It just tries to save it in a more compatible hoop size. So now you're done. You can actually go ahead and load this into your embroidery machine to stitch it. So regardless of the method you choose for your teeth, whether you sew them in your embroidery machine or sew them yourself, whether you have it just be a single piece of fabric or be two-sided, you want to go ahead and do this step. So like I mentioned at the start of the video, the goal is to actually get your tooth underneath the satin stitch that forms your mouth. One thing you need to keep in mind when designing your tooth is just to make sure that it is not in your seam allowance. So if you had this tooth in this seam allowance area right here, it's going to just get grabbed when you go ahead and sew this head together. So I do have it right along the edge of this seam allowance, but definitely do not want to place this in your seam allowance because it will not look good. So for your tooth placement, you want it to land in the middle of your satin stitch. And that's because when you go ahead and attach your tooth, you're going to have it attach in the middle of this stitch so that you can trim the excess fabric above the tacked stitch. And so when you go ahead and make your satin stitch, it's going to grab all of the fabric so that you don't have any excess above this stitch. So you do need to make your satin stitch a little bit wide. I'd say maybe 2.5 millimeters at the minimum. And so you don't want to have anything too thin because then you just won't be able to capture this tooth so that it attaches nice and strongly. And then on top of that, so you don't have any excess fabric poking out of the top. What you want to do is to make a couple placement lines underneath the area where your satin stitch for your mouth is going to be. So this is the design for my mouth, and if I click on this little piece here, we can see that this is actually just an outline stitch, which I ran right where I want the top of the tooth to run. So it starts at the edge of the tooth and it ends at the other edge of the tooth. So when I go ahead and stitch out my tooth and then have it ready to go, I want to line up the edge of the tooth with this line here. So when I have my tooth stitched out and I have my mouth ready to be embroidered, I'm going to stitch this placement line first and then line up my tooth with the edge of this line here. And then I'm going to have a second line that's actually going to stitch over the top of the tooth. So while I'm going to line up the edges of the tooth with the end of this line, I'm actually going to place it a little bit higher, just about where this stitch would end, so that the tooth is going to get caught by this second outline stitch, which comes along here and is just going to tack it down. So even though I'm going to place it first with this stitch, I still don't want to take the risk of this satin stitch potentially getting it out of line. To make these placement marks, you can just use the outline object tool, which is right here. And so you would just trace right along where you want your tooth to land. And it's just going to be a couple clicks and you just hit the check mark. And then the same thing with that second line there. It was just another outline stitch, although I did make it considerably longer just to be safe, and then hit the check mark. You can make this 2 different colors, which is a good idea because if you don't, it's just going to stitch them both in a row, so you would have to manually stop your embroidery machine from stitching the second line. So you can just make this any other color besides the one that you use for your first line, and then your embroidery machine will stop and give you a chance to go ahead and lay that tooth down onto the fabric before moving forward. So for the satin stitch, I just went ahead and made sure that the outline stitch lands right in the middle of my satin stitch. So when you make a satin stitch in Embroidery, it's actually referred to as a column stitch. So that's this button right here. It's going to be two-sided, and what that means is that you just have to tell it where one edge of the satin stitch is and then where the other edge is. So the first 2 clicks you're going to make are going to be the end of the satin stitch, and that is right here. So then whatever side you want to start with, you just go ahead and click that button, and then you go ahead and trace along the edge of where you want that satin stitch to land. So I'm not going to walk through this whole thing here, but let's just say I want it to end right here. Then that's my final placement of that side. So then I click my other side where that started, and then just click along, finally ending up wherever I want. And then you're going to right click your final node, hit end of segment, hit the check mark, and then you're done. So if I went ahead and generated stitches, you can see that this is just a nice satin stitch. I generally don't adjust the parameters of a satin stitch in Embroidery. I find the basics to be just fine. And then importantly, these tacking stitches run just about in the middle of the satin stitch so that it gets caught nicely in the stitch itself. And then to get it even, you can go ahead and just mirror these objects. So I would select my 2 placement lines and then the satin stitch that forms this side of the mouth, right click and group them together, and then you can go ahead and copy and paste and hit transform, flip horizontally, and then place it however you'd like. So then I also went and edited out this center piece here because I don't want to duplicate this area right here. I just want to form this other side of the mouth. So if you see what it actually ended up being, you can see I don't have this vertical satin stitch on this mirrored object. I just have the other side of the mouth. So you can see that I've reordered it so that I have my 2 placement lines, and then it's going to stop and switch colors. I've actually changed it to be so that these 2 second stitch lines are 2 different colors so that I don't have to scramble and get them both placed. So these 2 lines are 2 different colors just so that my machine stops and I don't have to stop it. So this is the line that tacks down this tooth, and then this is the line that tacks down the other tooth. And so after that, you want to have your satin stitches. And then if you choose, you can go ahead and also make the outline object of your pattern piece, which I always do because I find it very convenient. So from here, you can go ahead and compile it and turn it into your desired file format. So mine's just a .pes. I center it in my hoop, and I'm not going to save this because I already have my file made. But from here, you can go ahead and load this into your embroidery machine and get started stitching this out. So I've got my teeth stitched out. I went ahead and did that in my embroidery machine. So if you want to sew it yourself, you certainly can. And if you were doing just a one-dimensional tooth, so just one piece of fabric, you don't actually need to cut them into the tooth shape right now. You could just cut a somewhat large piece of fabric. And I say large, I just mean something larger than the shape of the tooth, because you can just stitch that into the mouth and then trim it into shape after. So here I'm ready to go ahead and get this sewn into my mouth, and I'm going to start by stitching out the first outline stitch that I walked through in the embroidered part of the tutorial. And just so you guys see what it looks like before that happens, here is my mouth gusset piece that is hooped with my stabilizer, and I went ahead and stitched the outline of the object onto the fabric, and this is an applique nose that I went ahead and did as well, mainly because you don't want to put water-soluble stabilizer on top yet. You want to do that after, because you're essentially doing some weird version of applique here. So I want to just go ahead and do one piece of stabilizer at the end so that I don't have to waste any and do it twice. But if you need a tutorial on how to hoop fabric, you can go ahead and check out one of my other videos, which I will link. So here I've gone ahead and stitched the first lines, which are the basting stitch, which is just going to tell me where I need to place the teeth. And so now I can take my teeth and place them, but I need to attach them somehow because I don't want to just put them down and then expect the embroidery machine to perfectly grab them. It's just going to end up making them uneven. So the way I choose to tack my teeth down is with some painter's tape. You can use any tape that isn't really permanent or gonna leave any residue. So I just prefer painter's tape. I suppose you can just use normal Scotch tape, but it's probably not gonna be too strong. So I just take the tooth and make sure it's laying in the direction that you want if yours is not symmetrical like mine is. And make sure that you get the top of it just a little bit over this placement line, because again, you want to get it all captured by that second stitch that's going to tack it down. But at the same time, you also want to be able to trim off the excess fabric above that tacking stitch so that when the satin stitch comes through, you're not going to have any white fabric sticking over the top, and it'll be nice and clean. So you just want to line up the edges the best you can and get it just a little bit over your line, and then use your tape to get it in place. But you don't want your tape to go where that second stitch will be. You don't want to stitch through this tape. So then when the second one, just the same thing, kind of smooth this out and then line up the edges and scoot it over. Okay. So the nice thing is if you make your tacking stitch not be too strong, you can actually just keep redoing this. You could use a seam ripper to rip out the tooth and replace it if you need to. If you go ahead and tack it down and if it's not symmetrical, you can just try again. So I'm going to go ahead and get this over to my embroidery machine so that we can do the tacking down stitch. Alright, I've got it all tacked down, and the placement of my needle looks like it's not going to conflict with my tape at all, so I'm ready to go ahead and stitch my second tack line. And like we programmed, since I made the second line for the second tooth a different color, it went ahead and stopped, so I can just double check the placement. Looks like the tape is a little bit close, so I'm just gonna kind of pull it down and then hit the start button. All right. So now that my satin stitch is another color, it's going to give me a chance to go ahead and take this out and check it. So let's pull this out of the embroidery machine and double check that it all looks all right. So I can already see that this left tooth here is a lot closer to the seam than this one is here. You can see this gap here is larger than this gap right here. So I'm going to go ahead and seam rip this tooth out here and try to place it again and hope that I can get it on the second try. So my next attempt went well, so now they look even. And so what I do from here is go ahead and trim off this extra fabric above these stitch lines, because if I don't do that, then the satin stitch will not go above this extra fabric and it'll look messy. So you don't want to take this out of the hoop because you still have more embroidery to do, so you can just use a pair of scissors, and I use a pair of curved embroidery scissors to get as close as you can to this stitch line without actually cutting through it, and just trimming off this extra fabric. So I just kind of get one side of the scissors underneath the fabric and push towards the stitch, apply some pressure, and then just stitch, or just cut rather. Can be a little awkward to do this. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clean this one up a little bit more before I move forward. I'm just having a hard time getting close with the camera angle. So I'm going to clean these up the best I can, and then we can go ahead and finish up our embroidery. So I got as close as I could here for this other tooth. And if you were just doing a one-dimensional tooth, so you weren't doing something two-sided like this, at this point you would just have a larger piece of fabric that is stitched into the line like this. And you could go ahead and trim the tooth into shape at this point. So you would want to just go ahead and either use an outline or a guide or something to make sure that your teeth are symmetrical, and just go ahead and use a pair of scissors to cut the shape of the tooth. If you waited to do that until after you ran your satin stitch, you would still have a little bit of extra fabric in the edge from where you couldn't quite trim underneath the satin stitch at that point. To draw out what I mean on a piece of paper is that if you have a piece of fabric like this, and if this is your second stitch that tacks down this piece of fabric, then you can go ahead and cut the shape of the tooth into the fabric and then do your satin stitch. So your satin stitch is not going to catch any of this extra fabric that you might have. But if you were to have your piece of fabric and then you have your outline stitch, but then you went ahead and did the satin stitch and then you cut your tooth, you're going to have all this extra fabric here at the edges stuck underneath this satin stitch that you wouldn't be able to trim out. So you want to trim the shape of your tooth into your fabric before you do your satin stitch. So finally I have a piece of water-soluble stabilizer that I'm going to lay on top of my piece so that the stitches don't sink into the minky and the stitches will be nice and clean as opposed to being buried beneath the pile of the minky. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch out the final satin stitch and finish up. So here's the final product all stitched out, and now we can take it out of our hoop and finish up. Alright, I think the teeth look really good. They're all captured by the satin stitch, and there's no extra fabric sticking out over the top of them thanks to our trimming, and they look good. So because I stitched the outline of my pattern piece, I can go ahead and just cut this out directly on this line and finish up the plush. And here's the finished product. The teeth look good. They're nice and 3D, sticking out from the mouth, as opposed to if we were to do embroidery directly onto the pattern piece itself. They're even and nice and clean. Don't have any extra fabric sticking up above the line of the mouth, which is what we wanted. And I'm pretty happy with it. So hopefully you guys can use this method to make some fangs of your own. And thanks for watching, and see you next time.